So in this video, I want to talk about one of the more common sources of stress, money, financial problems, and show you how these are directly related to this fallacy of misplaced concreteness and how this is a fascinating error because as a cognitive scientist, I talk about thinking errors all the time, but this one rarely makes the top of the list, but it may be at the top of the list in terms of the core error that causes stress and anxiety. And I'll show you this is all connected to the ego and self. But first, just as a reminder, well, we're a species that suffers from amnesia. Most people, we forget that as human beings, we've been on the planet for about 2.5 million years. Our version, Homo sapiens, has been around for about 200,000 or 300,000 years, and money has only existed for a remarkably small fraction of that time. So money is really new. And so the fact that stresses us out could be tied into just this is a new adventure in the human experiment that 40 to 70,000 years ago, everything about being a human being changed. And we suddenly started buying into these abstractions. Well, we created the abstractions like language, but then we started to buy into them and believe that they are real. And that's what the error is about. So to give you a few more examples of this error of reification or this misplaced concreteness fallacy. So you may look at me and you say, well, I'm male, or you look at a cat and say that's a cat or a dog and whatever. So you can look at examples of a category, but you can never experience the category in its totality. And so while you say, well, I'm an example of a male, you can't experience maleness or catness or dogness or carness or any of the other categories that we typically buy into as being real properties of the real world. And of course, money is the best example of this. So I could just hold up an example of money and you could say, well, point to it and say, that is money, it's a thing. And that's not true. What's happening here is I can show you an example of money, but money as a construct, as it exists as a collective social abstraction, and so you can't experience it. And it is existing in exactly the same way as the ego exists. And so if you're on this quest of know thyself and trying to figure out who you are, and you start checking off the list and you say, well, I'm an introvert. Well, that may feel like it's part of who you are, but the ego does this illusion all the time. It feels like a thing, like a self, but it's actually part of a collective social abstraction. In other words, you're only an introvert because extroverts exist. And you're only anxious because other people have taken other tests and they scored differently. And so this is what psychology does. They come up with this normal curve. It's a bunch of people have taken a test, and then we abstract from that these categories, and then we find where you're placed on it, but you're only placed on these categories relative to how other people score. And that's exactly the way money exists. And so you're broke because other people are rich. And so to show you this, imagine if you took someone like Bill Gates or some other billionaire and they traveled back in time 10,000 years. Well, they'd be stuck because they'd be trying to convince people that they're a billionaire. And then maybe they could pull it off, but it's really just working in to get other people to agree. And you'd say, well, why don't they take some gold with them? Anyway, it's a thought experiment, so why not, have some fun with it and take some gold into the past? So now you got Bill Gates taking a couple, truckloads of gold back into the past. Well, he's still stuck because he has to convince people that's his gold. See, that's the tricky thing about things. Not only are the things themselves illusions, but there's another illusion behind all this, and that is the illusion of ownership. How does any billionaire convince people that this is my gold? Well, the only way you do it is to, sell your argument and hope they buy into it. And if they buy into it, then it's yours. Same exact thing happens with the ego. And so maybe there's these mental states that go through your skull, depression, anxiety, and it's like holding that brick. And if you buy into it and you say, I'm depressed, it's like saying, hey, this is my gold. And if you buy into it and it works and other people agree with it, then you've done it. And if you don't buy into it and you see through the illusion and you see that it's part of a collective social agreement, that only exist when every other thinking mind is on the same page, then you may drop that piece of gold, you know? And it's like it was never mine to begin with. I mean, it's this amazing illusion that we're all living in, that anyone can own anything. Um, well, like to quote Elon Musk, he said, and it's an interesting quote. He said, "If we stop making things, there will be no more things." And I think Elon was actually talking about this like most of us talk about things. We fall for it. We think that these things are real properties of reality. But actually, his quote can be interpreted in a different way. If we stop making things, which is to say, we stop making this fallacy, and we realize how these exist, which is to say mental constructs, not properties of the physical world, well, there'll be no more things. And that may be a good thing. Because this abstract world, one of the things we're discovering is that even though it was really powerful, and it may be the reason that we survived a very dangerous past, but to live in these abstract worlds is a very stressful experience. And so these abstractions have winners and losers, so they can be very exciting, but they can also, if we're a loser, then they can be very disappointing. And the same thing is with rich and poor. So if you're rich, it could be very exciting to live in this abstract world and have everyone else buy into this idea that you're rich. But then the downside of that, the yin to the yang of all this, is that if you're poor and everyone's buying into it, it's not so fun playing that side. But both have to play the game if the game of this illusion is going to exist. So I did a video a little while back on the Piraha, and this is a fantastic tribe because they represent probably as close as we can find in the modern world how we existed as human beings for the vast majority of our existence. And you could take any of them and throw them into the woods naked, and they'll come out with everything they truly need. No human-made things, but just things created within nature. And a fascinating part of the documentary, because Westerners have been interacting with them, and one of the Piraha, because they were bringing in tech gadgets and all this, and one of the Piraha said, "You almost make me want this." So you can kind of get this feeling like, they're just humans just like us. It's just they haven't been tempted by this abstraction, but they could be. And there's some evidence that, and the last part of the documentary, they've been tempted by, the abstractions too, and so they may eventually they may realize that they're poor. They may suddenly have this, they fall for this illusion, and suddenly other people have more things, which is to say they buy into this idea that other people can own anything and that the thing even exists. And once they buy into that, then suddenly they're poor, and they're broke and they have no money because they don't have money. And there was a culture before money took place. So if you're going down this path and you feel broke, take it apart. Okay, where is you coming from? Remember, the ego is not who you are. It's a part of the collective social agreement. It's part of this kind of hive mind of thinking, where it exists literally as a social abstract level. And so your ego isn't even who you are. It's who society is telling you are, and that's the real paradox with this. You go down the ego path and you keep thinking you're discovering more and more about who you are, but it's really more and more about who society is telling you who you are. And once you go down this path, you're going to discover that so many things fall under this illusion. Money is really one of them, and the idea of ownership, the idea that not only does a thing not exist, but certainly you can't own that thing unless everyone else buys into the illusion. Now, for some people, that may be a game worth playing. But if you're feeling broke and you're stressed out, go walk in the woods. Get back to nature, because when you're walking in nature, none of the human-made things are around. And so that temptation is a little bit more in the distance. And the woods you walk through are the same woods any billionaire walks through. It's kind of what happens when we play with these apocalyptic movies and these scenarios where suddenly there's a collapse. And what the collapse is a collapse of this social illusion. And everyone realizes, people are just walking over money because they realize it has no value. It's like they're thrown back into the real world. And so as close as you can get to that, I think, is actually in nature. Go for a walk and you'll see how these financial problems are constructs. Not just, they're not constructs of your mind. None of this is part of who you are. It's part of a social construct that most of us buy into, who we think we are.